Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Leadership and Culture in Healthcare. My name is Matthew Wynn, podcast host, and we are in the series where we are talking about mergers in the NHS. We're talking about group models where organisations operate under a single leadership. And to get his insights into this is someone who's been through this process. I've got David Carter. David, welcome to the podcast. Why don't you start by introducing to those that don't know you, who you are and what you do?
Hi, Matthew. Yes, I'm David Carter, Chief Executive of Bedfordshire Hospitals, NHS Foundation Trust, and we were formed back in 2020, in fact, right at the start of the pandemic, between Luton and Dunstable Hospital and Bedford Hospital, and I'd previously been the Chief Executive of Luton and Dunstable from 2017 and had been there prior to that from 2011. I am an accountant by trade, but I keep that well hidden. Previously was a finance director in the NHS in acute mental health and indeed a PCT many years ago. So that's me.
And when you say you being a finance director hidden, actually, let's just be really honest, you don't really, do you? Given that we work closely together, it's quite clear you're a finance director by trade. Yes.
Well, I think it has influenced, and we may come on to this, influenced some of the way in which I've gone about structuring the organisation, and but I don't think I've ever really understood the NHS till I stopped doing finance and actually started managing it properly, so to speak.
Well, let's start with why did the Luton and Dunstable Hospital and Bedford Hospital end up merging? What was going on? Because I think I'm right thinking that there probably wasn't the push for a group model at you. So what just tell us some of the history about why it happened.
The history goes back to many years, really, in terms of conversations about the future of Bedford Hospital, which go back more than a decade pre the merger, and that had come from. It's fair to say it was a challenged trust in the sense of both finance and quality. And I think probably it's fair to say that it had many of the challenges that small DGHs face, particularly as we went through the sort of early part of this century, where the pressure for DGHs to provide services on a much more 7-day-a-week basis, and that I think became challenging for organisations, and indeed locally to us in Bedfordshire. Previously, when I joined the AandE back in 2011, there was a full DGH at Welwyn Garden City. There was a full DGH at Hemel Hempstead, two very close towns to Luton, and they're no longer DGHs, and they're good examples really of the fact that smaller hospitals struggle to have the critical mass, to have the scale that was necessary. But Bedford, slightly different from both those two examples in being part of a bigger hospital, part of a bigger town, and indeed quite close to Hinchinbrook, which again is a smaller DGH than Bedford. So, but the history, and AandE had a long history of working closely with Bedford, being part of the county of Bedfordshire, and having lots of pathways in terms of clinical links, in terms of pathways. So the original proposals around Bedford Hospital were for, in fact, a link up with Milton Keynes, and indeed some proposals originally around changing the nature of Bedford completely in terms of its future as a DGH. That was obviously very politically controversial, and that no real changes came to pass. The agreement was never reached about the future of Bedford. So when we started getting involved back around 2018, 2019, we could see the benefits in creating scale across the two hospitals, because AandE, whilst a bigger hospital than Bedford, is still had many of the challenges in terms of the scale and critical mass that's necessary. And so it seemed to us that a potential merger between Bedford and L&D could achieve a multiple series of ends, including securing the future of Bedford Hospital as a DGH, but also creating that critical mass, not just for Bedford, but also potentially for the L&D. And that's what we strove to deliver across that period. So it came from a very difficult political place. And in fact, one of the interesting features of Bedford and Bedfordshire is the politics. So back in 2019, the Labour MP won the general election in 2019 by 145 votes, and the Lib Dem mayor in 2023 lost to a Conservative mayor by 145 votes. We might need to find out who these 145 people are, but it tells you a little bit about the marginality of the seat, not just two-way, but three-way between Lib Dems, Labour and Conservative. And I think that tells you a little bit about why it's been so difficult to undertake, sort of more radical structural change within the patch. So the purpose of the merger was to take away that uncertainty, provide long-term, and we made commitments as part of the merger process. 3 red lines that were clear for everybody, which was that 24/7 ED, inpatient paediatrics, and obstetric-led maternity would remain on the Bedford site, and they were a critical part of getting the merger over the line, given the scepticism by some parties that the merger was indeed a different way of closing Bedford as a DGH. So and the merger, we obviously inherited the staff who'd been through all that years of uncertainty, and indeed we see some of the effects of that in relation to difficulties in recruiting, because the uncertainty makes it not the best landscape for recruitment. So our goal was to try and give certainty, give a real coherent model for the future.
It's really interesting, actually, because the previous series on this podcast was with local authority chief executives, and that point about them operating within a local political mandate, and you've just described the Bedford situation as being a mandate that keeps on shifting because of marginal electorate issues. Do you think that was the major stumbling block for finding a solution for Bedford over the years, or was it about the fact that what you have just described, which are 3 really erudite, red lines around maternity, A&E, and children's inpatients, they were quite clear? So what do you think kind of tipped it to kind of make sure that it could happen after kind of 10 years of oscillation?
Well, I think, clearly the merger was supported because it gave certainty to Bedford. So we could get political support by saying, actually, this is going to end the discussion around the future of Bedford. But I think, going back to your point about some of the difficulties, one of the tricky issues in this particular geography is the way that the population is works in Bedfordshire and in this patch that we effectively have got across. We've got 3 big towns, and we've got Milton Keynes, which is now a city. We've got Bedford, and we've got Luton, and most of the population is concentrated in that. And outside those 3 big towns, most people live in very small towns and villages. Now that's different and makes a big difference than, for example, I live in Hertfordshire. In Hertfordshire, that's not quite how it works. In Hertfordshire, we have much more. We have the population lives in bigger towns. So whilst we've got the Lister Hospital in Stevenage, and we have got the West Herts Hospital in Watford, we've got other big towns. We've got St Albans, we've got Hatfield, we've got Welwyn Garden, we've got Hemel Hempstead, and actually you can. It makes sense, and you can have subacute provision in those areas, and it makes sense to do that. And in fact, we've got the new QE2 in Welwyn Garden, we've got the community hospital in Hemel, there is the St Albans elective cold site, and so on. In Bedford, that's much more difficult to do, because outside those 3 big towns and Milton Keynes, including Milton Keynes, people basically live in. When I looked at the statistics, it's amazing how many people live in towns or villages less than 5,000 people. That makes it much more difficult to provide a provision outside the main acute hospital. And so, as well as the politics, actually the geography made it very difficult makes it a very difficult patch to reconfigure.
And that's kind of the key, isn't it? Because it does mean that it added, I guess, to the need for a single site acute unit that people went to with good links and good bus routes and good rail links, etc. Which is
exactly,
I guess work in progress on all of those fronts in that respect.
Yes, and that remains a challenge for provision of services outside those big towns, in the sense that we've had some decisions to make more recently about where we put, for example, community diagnostic centres. But if you don't put them in Luton, Bedford, or Milton Keynes, you're putting them in places which are actually quite difficult for people to travel to. And so that particular dynamic has been quite important and remains important for how services are provided across the patch.
Mm. And so you talked earlier about the benefits of scale. You talked about the benefits of synergy, and your sites, your Bedford and Luton, are what, 20 miles apart?
20 miles apart. Yeah, 20 miles
20
apart.
miles apart, just about. I know the road well, or the roads well, because there are multiple ways to get between the two of them. What have you kind of what have you delivered, and how have you delivered that kind of symmetry when you've got two distinctive campuses delivering quite comparable services, but the both of them kind of in their own right, kind of needing to stand on their own 2 feet?
That's right. And in fact, we made some decisions quite early on about the way in which we wanted to structure the organisation. So it can be tempting, for example, to create sort of site-specific leadership, and we did not want to do that. We wanted to create cross-site leadership. So our model, broadly speaking, and we've got quite a different model than most trusts have. We've got a model whereby we have cross-site clinical directors for each specialty, cross-site general managers, and cross-site lead nurses. So if you take a service like cardiology, there will be a cross-site clinical director. We may have clinical leads on the sites, but a cross-site clinical director who's responsible for the service, together with a cross-site general manager and cross-site lead nurse. And the idea of that was that that was the best way to harness the opportunities of the leadership who could see the services on both sides, be responsible for the service on both sides, and then flex and move those services to get the best opportunities arising from the merger. And rather than creating separate teams, which then might tend to silo and isolate the services from each other. I was heavily influenced in my thinking about this from the fact that I had been in my previous role many years ago as the Director of Finance at Barnet and Chase Farm. And I joined Barnet and Chase Farm, I think, some 3 years after the merger between Barnet and Chase. And actually, when I joined it seemed like two completely separate hospitals that the teams from from the same specialty barely knew each other, and there was limited interaction. And indeed now, effectively there's a sort of unpicking of that through subsequent years through obviously the merger with the Royal Free. But I was determined that when we merged Bedford and Luton, that we right from the start tried to get our clinical teams. And the idea effectively is that we have for each specialty, that we have a clinical team, whether that's cardiology or respiratory medicine or urology or dermatology, whatever that is, that the goal of them being a single team, albeit operating on two sites. Now, that doesn't mean that each consultant or each clinician operates on both sites, but that they feel like a single team and work together. They learn. So if we have something that goes wrong on one site, that we're learning from the other side. Now, that's a work in progress. That'll take a long time, and each year you get slowly more closer to that, and you make more appointments, which are joint appointments across the two sites. But that's the idea of having a single leadership. Now, we've got a slightly unusual structure in that we and this is very unusual for an acute trust, is we do not have divisions. So most trusts have divisions of medicine or division of surgery. We've got no divisions, so we have a very flat structure with each specialty effectively reporting directly to the executive. And the idea behind that is to maximise the benefits of the clinical leadership of each of those specialties, but definitely cross-site. And I think that I can see now that our structure would, which I think it works well across the two sites, but it would start to break down if you, for example, had a third hospital in your group, that having a cross-site clinical director, let's say for cardiology, who's running across 3 different sites, would find that very difficult. And I can see why some of the bigger groups effectively have moved away into individual site leadership. I can absolutely see why that might be a more. But then the question is, well, why you? For me, the question would be, why are you merging if you're effectively running them as separate DGHs? For us, that never made sense. We wanted to run it as effectively a single, the idea of a single clinical team operating out of two different DGHs, but feeling like a single clinical team. As I say, that's a work in progress. Some specialties are nearer that than the others.
But I think that's an interesting observation, though, isn't it, about the differences, though, between whole sites and whole trusts versus what you've described, which is actually it was underpinned by actually having a flat structure in the first place. Because I think I'm right that that's the structure you had at Luton and Dunstable in terms of the approach that you used to have in the hospital, and that then got enhanced and developed even further.
That's not quite right. We actually did have a division. We actually had a divisional structure at Luton and Dunstable, but we had, I think, fair to say, struggled with that structure, and partly because I think it's more difficult in a DGH to find clinical leaders who want to take responsibility for a division. So, if you're in surgery and you're a orthopod, asking that you to be a divisional director who's also responsible for urology and all sorts of other specialties, which you probably have limited involvement, knowledge of, and leadership of. I think that's easier in big teaching hospitals where you've got a bigger cadre of clinical leaders to choose from. But for us, we'd always struggled with the divisional model and had looked at ways of perhaps experimenting with something different, and the merger gave us that opportunity. So the idea had come, I think, from Luton Dunstable, but actually was not a structure we translated from that. We actually had divisional structure when we were at Luton and Dunstable, but struggled with that model. And
so I guess that was important in terms of messaging of when the two organizations came together. There was change in both organizations because you were moving out what was a divisional structure, even though
absolutely,
you had good clinical leaders to say, no, we're doing this differently.
We're doing this differently. And I think that was important and I think it was obviously important that we had clinical leaders from both sides. I think we got lucky in some areas where on one side we probably didn't necessarily have the clinical leadership, but we did on the other side, and it matched a little bit of where we had some gaps. So it worked quite well. It worked out quite well for us. And in fact, one of the things that I was nervous about was the extent to which clinical leaders would want to be the clinical director for across sites. Having been, perhaps if you're a clinical director for the hospital you are, if you're especially, and then going across that, very different, particularly if you don't know that clinical team, if you've not been connected to them before the merger, and they're completely new people. And then, I think one of the things I would have thought about more in hindsight now is whether we should have asked some of our clinical leaders to make sure that they were undertaking clinical sessions at the other site. I think those that have done that, I think, have found the role, have found real advantages in doing that. So we never said, now that you're the clinical director for X specialty, you need to be doing some sessions on the other side. But I think if I had my time again, I'd think about whether that was worth doing. Not for permanent. I mean, it doesn't work necessarily for individuals permanently, but to do it for a period of time, and really then, because I think that then gets those clinical leaders really engaged and understanding the team on the other side. But we haven't done that, but I've been pleased that our clinical leaders on both sides stepped up to the plate. They really did want, we had a lot of people who wanted to do those roles, and that was really positive. And I think in a way, that's been my experience of people. We struggled to get people to do divisional roles because you were asking them to do something that they really weren't comfortable doing. Whereas actually, if you're a cardiologist, that's what you want to do, is lead cardiology. You don't necessarily want to lead medicine. If you're an orthopedic surgeon, you want to lead orthopedics. You don't necessarily want to lead the whole of surgery and be responsible for, urology 18 weeks and vascular finance.
Yeah.
But the people really owning their own specialty, and it's still an experiment. And we have had some people talk to us about their own struggle with divisional structure in other places. It's a hard structure to operate, really difficult, because it's a very flat structure, but it does give a connection as well between the executive and the specialty. In fact, straight after this I've got an executive review with one of our specialties. We meet those clinical directors, we meet those general managers directly, without the dilution perhaps of a divisional structure. But it is definitely a working progress. It's an experiment in some ways to see whether it can work for the long term.
And David, tell us about how the organisations came together, because one was, and I'm stretching my memory here, but I think I'm right, one was an NHS trust, Bedford Hospital.
Right, Bedford.
The Luton Dunstable was a foundation trust. So technically it was a acquisition, I think. But I've noticed your language all the way through this episode has been merger together. So what's your observations about how you came together? Was it kind of viewed as this was a takeover or this was a bringing together? What was that like?
I think that we took that decision right from the start, that this was not a situation where we wanted to present it as an acquisition. And now that has been done before, and in
other areas are very proud about their acquisition words.
In fact, I think the most famous example probably is Frimley, where the acquisition of Wixham Park, I think. I mean, I'm not close to that, but we did talk to them at the time. Was very much on that basis. It was Frimley, taking over, doing it the Frimley way, so to speak. And our view was that we did not want to do it that way, in a sense, partly because Bedford was not a was a challenged organisation, but it wasn't a basket case. It wasn't, and in fact, interestingly, along the way, we had some challenges getting the merger off the ground because the centre didn't see it as enough of a priority. We weren't solving a big enough problem for anybody for them to, and so moving the merger along, was very much perhaps more difficult. It's easier when people at the centre see you're solving a big problem for them. So and we didn't want to picture in that way. We wanted to and also L&D's had its own and remains having its own challenges, but had been, had obviously been, had been very successful in terms of particularly around its A&E performance, but also particularly against the national standards, being a very, very, very high performer. So was coming into it with a good reputation. But we didn't want to picture this as being an acquisition. However, of course, people aren't stupid, and they understand. They understand the way it works. And funnily enough, just I think it was a couple of weeks before the merger, I was walking down the corridor at Bedford, and I remember a couple of members of staff ahead of me were saying, "Oh, this merger is just a takeover, really." And I remember sort of tapping them on the shoulder, saying, "Pleased to meet you. I'll be the new chief executive, and can just sort of let me talk to you about that." As I don't think it is. I don't think it's going to be like that at all. So, but I knew right from the start that people would think that way, and it goes back to, you've got to build up that trust. You've got to build up that. It takes time that people start to believe what you're saying and trust you, and it can be very difficult because I think what I also hadn't understood and this is probably important, is that just from a technical point of view, really, in some ways, if you're a larger trust merging with a smaller trust, then quite a lot of examples is the person in the larger trust in a particular department, the department head, is often more senior, more experienced, because they're part of a bigger department. So when it comes to that, if you like, competition for the post, even if, which it's hard to avoid that playing out in the sense of, I don't know, you have a department where the smaller trust department head is an 8A and the larger trust is a 8B. Well, if then when you try and merge them across, there's an inherent advantage to the person, not because they come from the acquiring trust, but because they're actually
the bigger infrastructure, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, they're probably a more senior individual. They've got more experience and so on. And so, how you counter that of the idea that it's just the sort of the bigger trust one, they're getting all the jobs, and but I think you've got to be mindful of that and recognise that that's and there is a slight inevitability at some of that. But obviously, it's very important that you send some clear messages. And I think we did that in a number of ways. We certainly tried to do that through the board as much as we could. Clearly, as the acquiring trust, I ended up as the chief executive, and our chairman Simon Linnett ended up as the chair. But our vice chair was the former chair of Bedford. We in fact did something which was quite unusual, which was we had a shared medical director post, a joint post, where the current medical director of Bedford at the time of the merger and the medical director of AandE shared the medical director post. And that was us really trying to say we want to take both sets of clinicians with us. And that was not liked very much by sort of the people up the line, but it was an important way of us symbolising and messaging that we were determined this was to be a merger and not an acquisition. But they will be sceptical, but it comes back to the trust that you can build, and also I think you learn very quickly in this process. There's some really important symbolic messages. Just sort of little things that we did was to make sure that we didn't. We got rid of the old L&D lanyards and created a new lanyard that had both colours of both organisations. So that was important. That was little things, but important symbolic messages, which can upset people, but are important. And I think just one of the other things I'd like to reference, which has changed, is one of the things that we were unsure about is the way in which the executive team would work. And obviously, we were only a month. We merged on the 1st of April, 2020. COVID had literally just started, and so the way in which we thought we'd operate as executives did change slightly. I did have originally a notion that we would operate as an executive team on one of the sites for part of the week and then operate on the rest. Now that I think was a nice idea, but it never really was practical. The way that we've now settled down into working, I really like, which is that as an executive team, we operate across the two sites. So I usually will be on one site 3 days a week and the other site 2 days a week, and that's for most of my colleagues. So on any day of the week, there will be, broadly speaking, half the execs at one side and half the execs at the other. And I think that's really powerful as well. And again, I think I learned from that a little bit from when I was been at Barnet and Chase all those years ago. When I was at Barnet and Chase, our headquarters were at Chase Farm, and we had no offices at Barnet. So if you went there, it was very difficult to really go there in some ways. No sort of offices to operate out of, and actually your visits to our site became sort of symbolic in some way. They're tokenistic. Whereas we do have offices or office space. I mean, here at Luton, where I'm today, we've got more flexible office space, but we've got the ability to operate on both sites. And generally, if you ask member staff, where the executive based, they could not say they're based on one or the other. We are genuinely based on both sites. And I know that's tricky, but I would absolutely recommend that to any trust merging. With our dynamics, particularly, of two DGHs together, I think it's been a really powerful thing that we stumbled into in a way, but I would not change it now at all.
And of course, that does mean, in a light-hearted way, you're one of the few chief execs in the country that has a nondescript porter cabin part of the week and a beautifully original featured cornice, large sealed room in another side. So
that is absolutely true. And in some ways, that gives you a sense of the sort of difference in cultures of where the hospitals come from. The L&D is a more modern hospital that was built in the 30s, and whereas Bedford, it's got listed buildings, as you say. My office at Bedford is part of the building, and that heritage and that pride that goes with that from a long history. So that all plays into some of the challenges you face in terms of the cultural integration of the organisation.
Absolutely. Still doesn't mean it's any messier in either of them, but we'll
leave
absolutely
that
for another conversation, David. Yes. So you've talked about the reasons. You've talked about the approach and the clinical leadership and getting your exec to work across both and how that's happened. What was it like leading that change, though, as a chief executive? Because my hunch is that there were a wholesale of tough conversations and tough things to sort out between the two organizations, some of which you would have to do yourself as a chief executive, and you wouldn't have had a team straight around to do it. So what was that like leading that change?
Well, the context was also important, that the change was going on during the pandemic. And in some ways, I think that helped us in that inevitably we were forced, because of the pandemic, to bring our clinical teams, our management teams together in a way, to work together in a way that's, as we all know, in COVID, in some ways, a much freer environment that's to do things and try things and make changes. And so I do think that context helped us to accelerate some of that. It slowed us down, obviously, in terms of some of our transformation that we wanted to do, but I think speeded up some of the cultural integration work that we needed to do to bring our clinical teams together and get that off the ground. But you're right that it's, I suppose one of the things that I was keen on at the start was to express that our merger was a strategic merger. And what I mean by that is that my experience of the NHS through my career has been that mergers are often usually driven by one of three different motivations. They're usually driven by a motivation, first of all, either to reconfigure, because you're closing an A&E or you're doing some major reconfiguration, and that's the only way of making that work. Or it's driven by finance, big deficit which needs to be resolved in one of the organisations, or is driven by a big and significant clinical or quality issue that needs to be resolved. That wasn't the case for our merger, in that whilst all of those are, certainly the latter two, finance and resilience of clinical services, was an issue on both sides and remains an issue, but in terms of one that would be forcing a merger to happen. And so I believe that if you do undertake mergers in one of those three scenarios, I think that makes it very difficult. Whereas we had a bit more freedom because we weren't constrained by those parameters, and could look at it genuinely strategically. And a little bit that I think that we weren't necessarily, the most high profile of those mergers, because we weren't trying to solve all those problems. And so I think that made it easier for us to get on and try and do the right things. And so for example, taking a little bit more time to do things, taking a little bit more time to, bring your back offices together. I think we did that in a measured way rather than doing it at pace. Whereas if you're merging for financial reasons, you motivated that very quickly, and that can be quite damaging. That's been very tricky indeed in some ways, recognizing that for many staff, it's often the staff who work in some of the support functions like finance and HR and IT are the ones whose life is much more affected than perhaps a nurse on ward who, the merger doesn't affect them directly. Whereas if you work in finance or HR, IT, it definitely does affect you because we've obviously brought those services together. In fact, we've moved them between the sites and so on. So that group of staff gets affected very directly and personally by the merger in a way that not all our clinical services do get affected. But I think that building the trust with, particularly I think for me in Bedford, building trust that we didn't have a hidden agenda, that we were open to believing that Bedford has as much to offer as Luton. I've made lots of mistakes along the way and not got things right along various different parts of that journey. But I think we've been very fortunate as well from having a very consistent executive team. So that basically the executive team that we've got now is the same executive team that was formed at the time of the merger, which is quite unusual 5 years on. But I think important, that continuity and that building relationships over that time has been important. I mean, one of the things I think I'm proudest of, I think, is that when we first merged, the staff survey at Bedford and Luton were very different. So much higher levels of morale engagement on the Luton site than on the Bedford site. Now if you look at the staff survey results broadly across the two sites, you can't tell the difference between the two sites. Luton staff might argue that we've made them more miserable, but I think that's an important thing. I think if 5 years on we had big differences between the morale engagement on the two sites, I would think that we'd got things wrong along the way. Whereas, and clearly much of the staff survey nationally has declined through parts, certainly during the early years of COVID. It's come back up again a bit, but I use the staff survey as a very good barometer of how people are feeling. And as a post-merged organisation, conscious that that's a tough place to be in terms of your morale and engagement and so on. And we're not where we want to be. We want to be at the top. We're sort of in the packet, I suppose, at the moment. It's probably the best way of describing it. But in fact, just today I've been looking at the free text feedback I've got from the staff survey. Just dropped in my inbox today, which is always fascinating to look at, and the variation in views of people, and still a lot of merger talk in a way in that staff survey feedback. But the fact that we've now got a very similar staff survey across two sites, to me is a positive.
Yeah. And good to see you using that staff survey in the right way. As you say, it's a good barometer, but it's also, I think the evidence now shows, and I can talk for ages on this, so I won't, but it's a good indicator of what care is likely to be. It's a predictor as much as it is a rear view mirror. And we can drive down as providers into very kind of lower levels of teams, etc., to understand how well they're doing. So David, as you think about leadership in your type of organization, and you've just said something interesting. You've had and those of us that work with you know your team and love your team, and goodness knows how they do it, but we do love your team. But they've stayed and they've seen it through, and 5 years is a long time ostensibly for an exec team to stay together. What's the sustainability and what's the next step in kind of thinking? Because you'll always be thinking, well, okay, if I'm not here, if Kathy, your great chief operating officer, is not there, etc., who's next? What's the challenges? I guess of working at a larger trust and bringing a pipeline of people through that can lead in the way that you've got your exec team leaders and your other general managers, etc.
Well, I think having it in a bigger organisation creates opportunities. I mean, you've got more. That is definitely an advantage, and the bigger infrastructure means that there are more opportunities. However, having said that, of course, our flat structure is a challenge in the sense that without divisions, that creates more challenges of that flat structure of those certainly, particularly along the general management and lead nurse progression. So we have to find ways around that. But I think that I'm proud of some of the continuity that we've created, and I think that goes back to all about culture, of trying to create the right culture within the organisation, and the fact that we've I think we lost a lot of people during the merger. I mean, people, as I said, sometimes that's because you've got to create competition between. We didn't make redundancies. I think we made a tiny number of redundancies through the probably less than 15, probably something like that. I mean, tiny numbers of redundancies, and those were ones where you literally have got two heads or two leads, and it's very difficult to find any other solution out of it. But clearly, some people choose. But I think that particularly, I saw people in Bedford who struggled with being part of a much bigger organisation, and so you do inevitably get some loss of some talent at that point. But I think now that once we're past that, using the opportunities of the two sites, and I think that's good for if you're a general manager, for example. You've got it's difficult, running two AandEs, two maternity units, and all the rest of that. But the fact that you've got an immediate comparator is really useful as well. So the first question we always ask, we've got a problem on one side, I think, well, how do we do it the other side? Is it different, or is it the same, or is it I think as well, the other thing that we're focusing on a lot is clinical leadership and the development of the skills of our clinical leaders, and recognizing that it's a really tough gig to be a clinical director, and it's a tough job being that across two sites. It's a tough job doing that in the modern NHS with all the challenges we face and the setbacks that we face. And therefore that we need to do much more in terms of supporting those individuals who are, in fact, I was at one of our CD development days last week, and we were talking about the fact that they are absolutely subject matter experts in their specialty, but they're not necessarily subject matter experts in the thing that they do a lot of, which is behavioural psychology and man management. And we can't just expect to throw them into those roles without really supporting them through that part of it. So whether that's doing consultant job planning, or whether that's motivating a team, that's the work that we do. And now that we're doing work, for example, we've got a new consultants program, so when we appoint consultants, we start working them on management straight away. Whereas in the old days, I think we'd leave them for 10 years before we ever got near them talking to them about management. But now, right from the start, we want to do that. And again, seeing the opportunities that a two-site organisation brings in relation to that. And I think that clearly is an example, one of the benefits of the group model. And we're a very small group, 2 DGHs, but clearly the opportunities that come from the bigger groups, the ones in London where you've got DGHs and specialist hospitals together, I can see that is quite a good way of keeping your best talent in a way that it might be a struggle to do for example, as a small standalone DGH where there's less opportunities to move people around.
You're just not going to be able to offer that development, and I think I recognise we're in a different sector in my organisations, but that same issue of how do you get clinical leadership to help them be great people leaders as well as technical leaders is really important. And it's interesting, the dynamic that's also very large, which we have between our organisations, is clinicians working across, and you've got clinicians working full-time in my organisation and I've got them vice versa, and actually it takes a different type of leadership and approach and adaptability that we haven't done before, have we? No. It's great.
And one of the benefits we've seen from the merger has been certainly in relation to consultant recruitment, where consultant recruitment is very difficult if you're recruiting to a very small clinical team. That's what people who apply fear of being, part of a small team where that pressure becomes unmanageable. Whereas now we are obviously trying to recruit people in to say you are part of a much bigger team, you're part of a cross-site team. You may want to work on one site, you may want to work on both sites, but the leadership and support. We haven't got many examples of cross-site rotas and cross-site on-calls yet, and that may or may not come. In many ways, that's dependent on the specialty. But the support and the point I made earlier about having the feeling of being a single team with single clinical team is a really powerful one if you can get that right, and still remains our model to strive for.
Well, David, it's been fascinating listening to you, and I talk to you quite a lot in normal business, but actually talking about yes, don't say that in a positive way, but talking about actually how you lead is been really interesting. And we've heard today about how two trusts come together. You brought those two teams together. 10 years of probably oscillation around the Bedford hospital site, small DGH, then really leading into a merger approach. And you've talked very much about how to the commitments that you made as a team to local community, which obviously paved the way. You talked about how to manage that change. You've talked about some really interesting aspects of cross-site leadership and how not to be bogged down in tiers, but actually have I think a great lean structure that the executive are very close to, which I think is important to you all in how you've gone about things. No divisions, but also the approach of not taking over, but actually creating something new and bringing together. And the benefits, hopefully, that you are already seeing, especially in retaining and attracting people, but also developing things for the future. If you were to say one quick thing about your hopes for the merged organisation over the next few years, what might that be?
I think that we continue to flourish and improve. We need capital. We need capital to develop both of the sites. But also, I hope that we also start to get a more external focus. Clearly, a merger does make you very internally focused for a while. And we know that the answers to many of the problems that we've got are not inside the organisation, but outside, and that we've got a lot to offer in terms of some of the solutions that we need to have. So, I want to see, in some ways, the staff survey is my barometer every year. I see that going up, and we know, because I know that when staff have got high morale, they're engaged, then we get great services. And it's, in some ways, it's not more complicated than that in terms of managing NHS organisations. And so we will continue to try and put our staff right at the centre of our mission, and hopefully get to a really good place in terms of their morale, their engagement, and actually then the impact they will have on not just inside the organisation, but outside the organisation.
What a great way to end this episode of the podcast on leadership and culture in healthcare. David, thank you so much for sharing your insights, and I'll probably see you next week very soon. Thanks
Thank you,
very
Matthew.
much.